All right, my name is Dylan McGee, and this is my SAL 384 project on analyzing reach and its effectiveness in the UFC. So what is reach? Well, the basic definition for reach is the physical measurement of the length from one end of an individual's arms to the other end when raised parallel to the ground. A good example of this is shown in the picture above of the little figure. In the UFC, if you've ever actually watched the sport before fights, during what they call the tail of the tape, they show uh, very crucial statistics about the fighters: their record, their height, their weight, and their reach. So reach is regarded as a very important stat within the sport of mixed martial arts. It's measured from fingertip to fingertip, and it's also commonly known as wingspan, especially in sports like basketball. And normally, a person's reach is close to their height. It is common for especially casual fans to think that having a reach advantage gives the fighter a huge advantage in their fight. So that's what I wanted to base my project off of. So some of the research questions that I wanted to do was, does a fighter with a longer or shorter reach compared to who they're fighting increase or decrease their chances of winning? Another one is, should certain fighters think about moving up or down a weight class depending on their reach? Because if their height is basically the same as their reach, if that's what's expected, if they do have a shorter reach than average, should they think about moving down a weight class? And the last question is, how can a fighter look at my research to help determine how relevant their reach is compared to their opponents in a future fight? So I decided to create a hypothesis stating that the longer the fighter's reach, the more likely he will be successful in the UFC. And that's what I decided to base my research off of. There are three main aspects of my project. The first one was scraping and cleaning data once I actually found some. The next was running regressions and visualizations. And then finally analyzing the data to make conclusions. So first, I had to go about getting my data. And one interesting thing about the UFC in specific is there's not that many great data sources out there that are easily available. It could be because the sport's still growing. It could be just how the sport is. But it is hard to find a good data set. UFC Stats does have a data set. That's the one I decided to base my research off of. However, there were a few problems when I first came into the data set. If you look in the bottom left, we see there's a bunch of empty spaces within the data set. And that's because the UFC has been going on since, I believe, the late 90s or early 2000s. And a lot of the early fighters have missing information here. If you see, there's like 8 fighters showing right there. I think 3 or 4 of them have missing information. So I had to find a way to clean up the data and make sure they weren't in my data set for better analysis. Another issue I faced was, if you look at the top of the picture in the bottom left, you see an alphabetical organizer, I guess you could say. Basically, you could show all the fighters with the last name A, but you wouldn't see any fighters with the last name starting with the letter B unless you clicked on that letter. So when I had to scrape the data set, I had to keep that in mind. If you look in the top right screenshot, you see 3 parts of my code highlighted, all with the letter A. That represents the web page for fighters with the last name A. I had to do that 26 times for all the last names. And I ended up merging the data sets together using the concatenation tool within Pandas, creating a variable called fighter table. In the bottom right, that's what the main fighter table, after all the letters were combined and scraped, look like. And as you can see, there's a lot of NANs, a few dashes. So next, I had to clean the data. The first I went about this was by removing all the rows that either had a blank space, those dashes, or the NANs that we just saw, particularly in the height, weight, and reach columns. I attempted the drop NA function within Python, and I gave that a go for a few hours, but it was messing up my data, and it was deleting rows that it shouldn't. I just couldn't figure it out, so I ended up resorting to Excel to clean my data. So I did that first, and then I had to convert standard height into inches. So if we look back, if we see in the bottom left, or I guess in the bottom right screenshot, in the height column, we see the inches symbol. Within the weight column, we see the pounds LBS with a period. I had to get this out of the data set because it was important for making sure I had accurate analysis. So within Excel, I use this really complex formula to take out the inches and convert it, or the inches sign, and convert it into just one number. And then I also replaced the letters LBS with a blank space and the inches symbol with a blank space for height and reach and weight. So that way the data set just has straight numbers, as we can see in this picture below. There's no inches sign, there's no LBS, there's no blank spaces other than fighters' nicknames, because not all fighter has a nickname, and that wasn't relevant for my research. So this is what the master table ended up looking like. I believe there was like 1,600 or 1,700 fighters in total. I then went to start analyzing my data, ran some tests, and I realized quickly that I ran into a problem and that I had to separate the data sets by weight class. This is really important. I'm happy I learned this early on in my project, so I decided to break them down into these 9 weight classes, starting at strawweight and ending at heavyweight. And you can see they're distributed by their weights if you're not too familiar with mixed martial arts. And here's some examples as to why it was so crucial for me to separate the data set into separate sets by weight class. An example is a fighter named Neil Magny, who's in the welterweight division. I believe that is the 155 pounds to 170 pound division. His reach is 80 inches long, which is one of the longest reaches in UFC history. The average fighter in his weight class has a reach of 73.5 inches. So he has a huge advantage against the people he's fighting in his weight class. However, the average reach for a heavyweight fighter isn't even 80 inches either. It's around 77.5. So here's an outlier. And then on the contrary, we have a fighter named Ray Borg, who fights in the 2 smallest weight classes in the men's division, flyweight and bantamweight. His reach is 62 inches, which is currently the 2nd smallest reach in the UFC for male fighters. The average reach for his divisions is somewhere between 66 and 68 inches. So he's really not even close to his competition. And I learned that if we regressed every fighter without separating them by weight class, we would be putting them on the same playing field, and it would give us inaccurate results. We would be regressing fighters with certain reaches, fighting against people in different weight classes, and that's not what I wanted. I wanted to see in each weight class, if you have a high reach for your weight class, what are your chances of actually being successful and having more wins? So after I separated the data into 9 different weight classes, I regressed all 9, and here are the results. The formula for my regression is in the bottom left. I just regressed reach to wins, and honestly, the results were pretty disappointing. There were 3 of the 9 weight classes that were statistically significant, those being the straw weight class, the lightweight class, and the middleweight class. And all 3 had negative coefficients. To kind of explain what that means is that's actually on the contrary, saying that reach affects wins in a negative way. So a fighter with a longer reach in his weight class has a worse chance of winning. However, these coefficients are extremely small. So it probably doesn't make that much of a difference at all. And all of the R-squared values for my regression results were very small, which I thought was pretty surprising. In the top right is just a screenshot of my regression in Python, just to show that I did it there. Here is all 9 regressions actually plotted out, because when I saw the results, I was taken back. I was expecting them to be a lot different. So I wanted to see what they look like physically. And there's the 9 weight classes. And as you can see, most of them are either straight or they're going down a little bit. So it does make sense with what the regression showed. So I guess from there, I decided to make some conclusions. The first one was something that may have been common knowledge to some, but I didn't know for sure. So with this data set, I was able to set it in stone that reach and height do have a direct correlation. I noticed this when I thought this would be the case when they said a fighter's reach is usually close to their height. But just by checking through this data, I did realize there was a correlation, so I ran a correlation matrix in Python. If we look at the top right picture, height and reach have a correlation value of 0.8845, which is a very strong positive correlation, which means height and reach, the taller the fighter, the bigger reach they're going to have. And I graphed that in the bottom right as well. And that's just a perfect example of a really strong relationship between two variables. And then the next conclusions come back to my hypothesis. Does having a long reach increase a fighter's chance to win? And based on my data and what I did to test, I say no. If we go back, my hypothesis was the longer the fighter's reach, the more likely he's successful in the UFC. And based off my data, my results show no evidence that hypothesis is correct. In fact, it shows that in some weight classes, they actually might not. They might have more of a chance to not be successful. And since that wasn't what I thought was going to be the answer, I started to think maybe as to why. And reach is very important in stand-up fighting when you're boxing, when you're using your hands, obviously. And the UFC is a form of mixed martial arts, and mixed martial arts is more than just boxing. In the UFC, there's so many different types of fighting techniques, such as wrestling, kickboxing, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, karate, and other forms of fighting that are used to help a fighter win. So even if a fighter does have a short wingspan compared to the person they're fighting, if they have a wrestling advantage, if they have a jiu-jitsu advantage, they're going to use that in the fight to try to win. So reach can be effective, and I do still think it can be, and it can help a fighter win if their strengths are standing up on the feet boxing. And here are just a few ways that I thought I could improve my research in the future. One was to add an additional column for gender. UFC stats combines male and female fighters, so I did have female fighters in my data set as well. And that makes things a little bit fuzzy around the strawweight and bantamweight classes because women weights do fall in with those. So my strawweight table did have women fighters in it. And that could make a difference in the results of the data. But I did not have the time or an efficient way to be able to go through all 1,600 plus fighters and determine which ones are male and female, and then divide the data sets that way. Also, adding a minimum number of fights, I think, could have been really important. The reason I say this is because the data set shows every fight has been in the UFC, and the UFC is different than most sports. You could fight one time in the UFC and you could never show up again. You could have a one fight contract, could not go well for you, and you may never see fighting for that organization ever again. There are fighters in the data set say they did have a long reach compared to average. They had 2 fights, they lost both, and they never fought again. If I could have a minimum fights, combining the wins, losses, and draws, say a minimum of 5 fights, we might be able to take out those outliers and have more accurate results. And then lastly, find data on leg reach, because MMA uses all forms, like we said before. If we could find leg reach, for example, John Jones, one of the most popular fighters, is known for having really long legs and a really huge leg reach against his opponents. That would be some really interesting evidence to use in the future. And here are my references. And thank you for listening. I appreciate it.